Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to Team Liquid Strategy's new show, Strat Chat. Today is June the 27th, and we're going to be talking about hard counters in game design. All right. Today on the show, we have me, John, and White Wing, and who we like to call Italian Cats. It's Teoita.
Hello.
That
Yeah,
picture.
Italian.
You'll pay for this, Chris.
I love you. All right. So today we're going to talk
Probably should
about
introduce ourselves.
hard counters. Yeah, go ahead, White Wing, you can start.
Hi everyone, I'm White Wing. All of us are on Team Liquid Strategy. Former Protoss player. I play random now. I'm a teacher by trade. Got my degree in economics, and I've been really interested in game design. I've written a few games, that sort of thing. So, yep, that's me.
Awesome, Teoita.
Hello, I'm Theo. I've been playing Protoss since 2010 until 2013. Then I took a break because I'm tired of playing competitively. And I guess that's it. I've been in Team Liquid Strategy since it started in summer 2012-ish when we did the ridiculously insane PvZ Bible thing. And that's about it, I guess.
Excellent. And I'm John. I used to play Protoss and Zerg. And I've been writing a lot for Team Liquid strategy as well as just my own Starcraft II notes on the forums. But recently, I kind of lost my passion and started playing League of Legends, and so I've been doing that a lot. And I know I'm gonna get tons of hate for it, but I actually really enjoy the game. So,
So we give him shit about it all the time.
whatever, you play Dota.
Exactly.
He still works on
Exactly.
articles, though. He still watches. So we're going to be discussing hard counters as it relates to game design, and StarCraft in particular.
Mhm.
Any questions you have, feel free to ask them in the stream chat or tweet it at us on Twitter at TL Strategy Chat, or you can just post them in the Team Liquid thread as you see fit. So
I just want to back
why
up.
don't we get started?
I just want to back up one more second. Let's talk about like what we want to do with the show and where it came from. Just to let people know, like why we're doing this.
Well,
Like
originally,
up?
Teo wanted to rant, and then Heyoka said, "Hey, you should do a show."
That's not it exactly. The basic idea was Team Liquid didn't really have any legacy of the Void content before after the initial article we did for a variety of reasons. And so we just kind of decided to, instead of writing our usual front page articles, we decided to do a show and also, if we could, like publish articles from pro gamers like the one you've seen from QXE on the Liberator that was spotlighted, the one from TLO and whatnot. And so we decided to do a show instead of doing Team Liquid strategy articles like we always have, because just to try something and see how it works, I guess. That's the other reason. Also, yes, me ranting.
And hopefully we're a little bit more on point with talking about things on time.
Yeah, the other thing is having a show, like you do it once every week or twice every week or once every 2 weeks or whatever, and you just do it. Whereas with an article, there's editing to be done, there's graphics and whatnot, so it's a much slower process. So you can't be as quick to comment on things.
All right, excellent. So, go ahead, Joel. Start us off with the discussion.
All right, so today we are going to be talking about one of my more interesting topics to me personally, which is counters in game design, specifically hard counters in game design, when they're applicable and should be used, when they shouldn't, and of course, since this is Team Liquid strategy, Jad, we're going to be talking about StarCraft more than the other games, but it should be applicable to just games in general. So I guess we should probably just start off with the definition of what a hard counter is. So why don't you start us off with that, Teo?
Well, it's actually not a very easy definition because you can say all sorts of things. You can say a hard counter is something that makes a strategy strictly not viable. For example, I guess Immortals and Mech, or Swarm Hosts and Protoss without Colossus. Those things just do not work. It just doesn't end well for one of the sides. But it's, I think, like a too general of a view, like because we want to focus on unit design specifically, I guess. So you can just say a hard counter is a unit made exclusively to kill another unit, and it's the only way of dealing with said unit for the most part. For example, Corruptors and Colossus in Wings of Liberty. Zerg in Wings could only go Corruptors if the Protoss went Colossus, or he would die. I guess that's my
Yeah.
idea of how to define a hard counter. So
my
there's lots of
definitions.
gray areas. It's not very easy to define because you can say things like, I don't know, mutas and phoenixes or corruptors and phoenixes, but that's more of a, like, you need a specific unit to deal with another unit, but it's not necessarily a hard counter. There's various degrees of how much units counter each other, and this depends specifically on the matchup, the metagame, and whatnot. So it's not an easy
Okay.
definition. I think the easiest is just you need this unit to fight this other unit straight up, or you die, period.
See, my definition of hard counter is a fair bit different than that.
Mm.
So just you can talk about it in terms of exclusively unit design, but unit design refers to the design of a specific tool within the tool set of the race function. So counters have to be thought of in terms of what the race is capable of doing at the specific point in time to respond to what the opponent's doing. And units are only a tool. So think about it in a larger term, in kind of a more macro term is more useful, kind of a larger scale. To me, I mean, the best example I can think of a hard counter would be playing rock, paper, scissors. Um, Rock, hard, counter, scissors. If you go rock and your opponent goes scissors, you win. End of story. There's nothing else to it. There's no response they can do. They can't like say, okay, well, give me a minute and we'll switch to paper. There's nothing there. It's one player wins, the other loses. But
That's,
in games more
hold
like
on one thing.
Starcraft, there's more of a wider gradient.
Yeah, but that's, I think, a definition that is easy to confuse with build orders, wins or losses, which are overrated in the first place.
Well, yes, but
But
I'm not discussing exclusively build orders at the moment.
because, yeah, and that's more tied to strategy than hard counters or not, if that makes any sense.
Right, I'm not.
Like, you can
But
choose to play to not account for one strategy, and then that strategy will hard counter you, but that doesn't mean your race or your faction, whatever, doesn't have the tools to deal with a strategy
right.
other than a
That's true.
specific thing.
So
So there, my mic is clipping. Okay, my mic is terrible, so it will clip a lot. I'm sorry.
sorry, we'll get him a new one. Hopefully. But I mean, there's a wide range of gradients of counters. So a hard counter could be said to be a strategy, or because it doesn't just have to be a unit that's a counter. You could have a strategy like what's the counter to a two-base mutaplay. There's no specific unit you build to counter a two-base mutaplay. But there's several different things you can do. So I mean, it's just a hard counter is a strategy or option or tool. In this case, maybe a unit that gives you a high percentage of victory in response to something your opponent has done. So my opponent's going mech, I can go Immortal Archon, and that gives me a high win rate against the mech strategy.
I like when I think of hard counters, I think of like you end up with like a very binary type of
Yeah,
type
exactly.
of relationship. Like either like you have something and like it just wins, or you don't have it and you don't beat the other thing. That's kind of how I see hard counters end up cropping up. So for
I
like
think specifically the if you don't have it, you lose is the important thing there, because you can
Okay.
look at the Legacy Ultralisk, for example, and if you don't have the new Ghost or whatever, you cannot kill an Ultralisk with Bio. It just doesn't happen. So there's this situation where if you don't have Unit X, Unit Y destroys you, which is, well, specifically to StarCraft, I guess, but that's kind of how most people think of hard counters and how they're easy to define.
okay, fair enough.
So it's so I mean, talking about in terms of percentages, like I mean, if you go Blink Stalkers, right? What's the response to Blink Stalker in PvP, for example, is to just kind of slowly expand Turtle, because if you try to push out and kill them, they're just going to backstab you. So that it's a hard counter doesn't have to be a unit. And on the focus you were mentioning, if you don't do X, you die. that is a very binary relationship. But imagine a situation in which you have three possible responses to what your opponent's doing. The second and third give you like a 55, 60% or around a 50% win rate from that position. That's a decent percentage. It's more of a soft counter.
Right.
But the first option gives you like an 80%. Right. So you don't necessarily lose if you don't do the first one. So it's not a flat out you don't have this, you lose. But because its win percentage is so overwhelming from that decision, it's still a hard counter.
Yeah, and another thing to point out is you can't. I don't think you can look only at win percentages, but also at the actions players take. As in, Blink Stalkers in PvP, for example, don't have a counter because pro gamers are so good with them. They can be terrible in straight up fights, but it doesn't matter. So because a skilled player can outplay the other player or whatever. So there's room for individual skill to show up. With a hard counter, I think it's less important because you need a specific thing or you're fucked. Period.
Right, so it seems like we're talking more about like only having one tool to deal with a problem rather than having a tool that's so overwhelmingly good that if you have it, your opponent can't do anything about it. So I mean, you get two different things. Like like Immortals crush tanks in reasonably small numbers, like by themselves. Like an Immortal versus a tank, there's no question which unit wins that.
Right.
But there's still plenty of other ways of dealing with a tank. Like you don't outright lose to a tank. You lose to siege tank pushes if you don't happen to have Immortals necessarily. Like you can there are other possible solutions. Like you could warp prism drop and force a base trade or other things. So I don't think.
Speaking of that, the series between Byung and SKT in the playoffs a while ago when he went mech 3 times in a row on the same map is a great example, where he lost 2 games in 2 completely different ways to Rain and Parting, and neither of those actually featured the quote-unquote hard counter to mech particularly. So it's it's a situation where players have different choices and they all kind of work well.
I think
that's great for game design in general when that's the case.
What makes that possible, like in StarCraft in particular, is just that we have all these complex interactions with, you know, time and numbers. Like an Immortal versus a tank, like an Immortal always wins. But you have like an Immortal versus like 6 tanks, obviously the tanks win, you know? And it depends on where you get it. It depends on
Immortals are pretty good.
They're not that good.
But it also depends on like what point in the game you're at. So like for instance, like if we think back to like Wings of Liberty, and we think about how like technically the Air Terran army, battle cruisers, Ravens, Vikings would actually just like completely destroy Broodlord and Fester. But the problem was that Broodlord and Fester hit at like, you know, 12, 13 minutes. And there was nothing you could do at that point.
It was more like 15, but yeah.
Dude, in the later days, it was like 13, dude. It was crazy.
Yeah, people were just flat out rushing because they people were getting to the point where they were just assuming there was no 2 base all incoming, so they didn't even bother to scout with it, and they just coin flipped over.
Yeah, but they still had to account for 3 base builds. Oh well, anyway.
Yeah, it was like 9-minute hives, man.
The point is, 15 minutes was early enough that there wasn't much you could do about it. But
right, I think that's also what makes like pinning down hard counters, like in the definition, it is like when you have all these complex interactions, like timing and numbers and composition wise.
Right. So like to me, a hard counter is a percentage move. Like it has to describe a high percentage move because a unit itself and you know a unit tester can flat out hard counter another unit easily, but the context of the time involved and the whole game as a whole can mean that even if your opponent has units that are way better than yours in a fight, there are still plenty of other things you can do. Like for example, Mutalisks in PvZ. If your opponent makes a whole bunch of Mutalisks and you don't have the Phoenix to respond to them, but you have a ground unit, you can either base trade or you can try to buy time with ground units to get Phoenix out to respond to that. You don't flat out lose because you immediately simply because you're lacking the proper unit response. And while obviously it'd be preferable to have more units you could make other than just Phoenix, and I'm sure Teo will want to talk about that later. It's the notion of a hard counter needs to be in context of a strategic or tactical response and not exclusively a single unit. So.
Well, I have a
unit
question.
Design,
I just have a question. So, like, what happens if, like, for instance, you have a strategy like think about like tic-tac-toe. If you make the correct like first 2 moves and your opponent doesn't block you correctly, you automatically win the game, 5 moves ahead. So, like, for instance, if we're talking about, like, your opponent suddenly has Mutalisk and you don't have Phoenixes, is it possible that you could say it's still a hard counter? Because even though you have options at that point in time, if your opponent plays perfectly, you still would quote unquote lose.
Not necessarily. Again, it depends on the situation. If the Protoss, speaking SC2 HOTS specifically, if the Protoss went Stargate, Colossus, third base, and the Zerg gets Phoenix, and the Protoss has what, like 4 Phoenixes and 5 Stalkers or something, then yes, he's dead. If he goes 3 base Blink, no, because he has 7 gates worth of Blink Stalkers with good upgrades and a quicker third and also whatever. So it's another of the situations where it really depends on how the game went before that.
Okay,
you can't just say if you don't have Phoenixes, you're instantly dead. Unless it's me. I suck against.
I mean, that is a possible game state. Is what I'm saying.
Right, but there's more to it than that. So, your opponent makes Mutalisks, right? So you gotta ask yourself, what is the highest percentage move for me to determine what my best counter is? A hard counter would be a decision you make at that point that has a very, very high percentage move. From there, so something you can do to just shut your opponent down easily, and it's very reliable at shutting them down. Like, there's not much they can do to avoid being shut down. And that's really what a hard counter is if your opponent does X, you do Y, and then your opponent has no good response to you doing Y in response to X.
I think you can make that
really
more precise when you say your percentage of victory is higher when you do that than when you do something else. It doesn't necessarily have to be a high percentage to win in a vacuum. If you get what I mean. For example, late game PvT, Terrans need ghosts to quote unquote hard counter Templar. Doesn't mean they actually win late game PvT. It means if they don't go ghosts, they lose even harder.
Right. But that's not. I wouldn't describe that as a hard counter situation. That's an entirely different.
No, but what you're saying is a hard counter, like, always puts you ahead if you do it, but that's not necessarily a hard counter. It might just be that you're in a game-winning position.
Well, so
that's why it's hard.
If you take the Nash equilibrium, right? In StarCraft II, the Nash equilibrium is very, very fragile.
I don't know. Let's back up. So just talking about the Nash equilibrium really fast, because I think most people in the world don't know what that is.
All right. So in game theory, a Nash equilibrium is when both players are making the optimal move, given the assumption that the opponent that they're playing against is making the optimal move. So, if you yourself are assuming that your opponent is doing if you yourself are assuming that your opponent is doing the optimal thing he can possibly be doing at that time, and then you are doing the optimal response to that, and your opponent is doing the exact same thing to you, so that you're both making optimal moves in response to your opponent making optimal moves, that's called a Nash equilibrium. And so in StarCraft II, that's extremely fragile because of the notion of scouting and limited information. You can't know for a fact that your opponent's doing that at all points in time. So if your opponent, it's called a Nash, N-A-S-H.
Oh, that's from John Nash.
Superma. So if your opponent, since you can't scout necessarily what your opponent's doing at all points in time, your opponent can choose to do something suboptimal to break the Nash equilibrium, knowing that you won't be able to have an optimum response to his suboptimal move because you don't have the scouting information necessary to make that choice. So because of that, a Nash equilibrium in StarCraft is very, very fragile. But so you can talk about balance in terms of Nash. Yeah, it can be a little bit at first. It's a little bit of game theory, but if you do something to your opponent if your opponent does something suboptimal, and you manage to scout it, you can hard counter it in the sense that because you know it's suboptimal, you can do the optimal response to that, which because he did something that wasn't very good, you get a significant lead in the game, and that can be thought of in the RTS genre. That can be thought of as the so-called hard counter strategy. But in game design, or in designing StarCraft or Legacy of the Void, so to speak, we want there to be strategies per se, or rather, if people are in a Nash equilibrium and are following the Nash equilibrium, there shouldn't be anything any player can do to get a huge lead, as long as the opponent is continuing to follow the Nash equilibrium properly. And that, to me, is where the hard counter in game design plays in the most.
Oh, so you're saying the more hard counters you put, the harder it is to follow the Nash equilibrium, so the game becomes more unstable. If
I'm
I
more
get it
saying the
right.
fact that if you can come up with a hard counter strategy, if your optimal strategy, given that your opponent is playing optimally, given that you're playing optimally, so in other words, you're in a Nash equilibrium, and your optimal move has a high win percentage against his optimal move, given that you're playing optimally, then that's very, very bad for the game because that's to me is what imbalances, at least in terms of racial
Yeah.
imbalance.
Okay.
Okay.
Fair enough. Yeah, I
Um,
think, well, mathematically speaking, the math behind this is more fucked up when the two sides are asymmetrical. I'm sure there's
well,
messy
it's
math
very
behind
Sure.
it.
it means that when the game is asymmetrical, it means that there will be timings when one
Of
has a
course.
higher win percentage than the other. But as long as the opponent has a response that can delay to a timing that's later, or has an advantage, can take an advantage early to counter a disadvantage later, that it's okay. The main difficulty with an asymmetrical game is making sure that those timings, when one race is strong, doesn't have too high a variance in win rate. So one player, wins it, either wins by 10 minutes or always loses as their race.
Soul
For
Train
example, given their
versus
opponent. Or
Master Broodlord,
yeah,
for
you want
example.
to the Protoss
Just
versus
name one.
Infestor Broodlord is actually a great example of that. Because Protoss either won with a 2 base all in or they lost to Infestor Broodlords. It was extremely binary.
Or they did
Variance
With
that
a
beautiful
3 base
immortal 3 base all in. Oh
yeah,
Yeah,
god.
exactly.
the variance the variance of the win rates was extremely high. You could almost always tell who won a game at the high level of play based on how long the game lasted or
To
what
be
time the
honest,
game ended.
though, I think that can be reasonably not stupid in StarCraft as long as the game actually is exciting. If you look at PvT, basically the same happens, right? Like games longer than 20 minutes, Protoss just kind of always wins or close enough. But it's way less terrible than PvZ in Wings or TvZ in Wings, where
Or PVT and
because things
wings.
happen. Or well, PvT in Wings is
It's
well, I'm talking
PVT and
about
wings was
PvT
so easy.
either. I think, yeah, when you got the hang of actually reading what the Terran was doing, it was easy. Anyway, not
You
the
just
point.
rushed it 3-3. Easy.
yeah.
The
So
point, not the point. The point here is, as long like that sort of thing could actually be acceptable in SC2, as long as the game actually is fun to play
right,
and to
it's okay to
watch.
have
If that
it's
makes any
absolutely
sense.
okay to have variance at on win rates at specific times. So at 5 minutes per one race is advantaged at around the 5 minute mark and has a stronger. And if the game ends at 5 minutes, they are much more likely to win. But if it goes to 10 minutes, their opponent's more likely to win. And it's okay as long as it keeps swinging back and forth to various times, and then later on it's even at various times. That's all okay as long as the variance in win rates at specific times is too high. As long as it's not like game ends at 10 minutes, it's 100% Protoss wins. Game ends at 20 minutes, it's 100% Zerg, so on and so forth. And so it's hard having hard counters, and in that sense, at this timing, my opponent has such a huge high advantage. My only choice at this point, in terms of the binary concept we were discussing earlier, is to play super defensive, like in Heart of the Swarm, 3 base Terran SEV all in versus the Protoss. Protoss has to pretty much just sit back and wait for Terran to take his third base, or before they're even allowed to take their third base, because if they take it sooner, they just get medevac dropped
Yeah,
or Marine all in or something.
depends.
Um,
Depends.
I mean, if it takes
That's
too
kind
long for
of
Terran, you can do it. But
That's kind of oversimplifying the matchup. Depends if you're
well,
doing
yes,
standard RoboForge, yeah. But yeah, I
yeah,
get what you're saying.
that's what I'm describing. That situation, the standard Robo Forge thing. Terran has a very strong timing there. Protoss is best highest win percentage move at that time, if he was playing that standard opening, is to sit back on 2 bases until Terran takes his own third, and then take his own third, unless Terran takes too long and is or doing something weird or wonky. So, but that's not a hard counter because it doesn't give Protoss an extremely high win percentage rate when he does that. He doesn't automatically, start crushing his opponent because he did that. It was just his only option at that time, given the way the game developed.
Okay.
Fair enough. Yeah.
There were so a question that just got us in stream chat by Superman. He asked if anyone ever gathered data on race as a function of time. There were statistics on a Ligulac. I remember collected data on it for game length and matchup win rates. I did see data on that a while back. they also had data on all sorts of other fun things like win rate with the Mutalisk count, which I remember seeing like
Oh yeah.
for some reason
As-
if Zerg made exactly 39 Mutalisks, they somehow had a 90%
Yeah, I
win
remember
rate.
that.
But if they
Yeah.
made 40 or 38, their win rate was only around 50% or something.
Best statistic.
I'm just like,
Yeah, I
like
think that's called
that had me,
variance.
that exact number had me scratching my head for a while trying to figure out why that was. But like Eligulac is actually just a fantastic tool that I used frequently. But
I think Monk was gonna do it for PvT like at the start of Heart of the Swarm, but we never finished doing it, or he never finished doing it. But
Yeah.
from the
He lost
looks
his
of it,
hashtag passion.
yeah, exactly. From the looks of it, it seemed like yeah, Protoss was obviously reasonably advantaged in late game and Terran in the mid game, and Protoss again in the early game.
All right. So what exactly is like? Can we like nail down like an instance where in StarCraft II something is not necessarily a hard counter, but like harder than you would want it? Is there some?
Okay, so to me, the most frequently when that happens, it's what we also like to call a blind counter. Because as I mentioned before, the way Nash equilibriums work or how they're broken. Okay, so if a game is designed well, hard counters only occur when a Nash equilibrium is broken. As long as a Nash equilibrium is properly playable. So they should only ever happen when a Nash equilibrium is broken. And in StarCraft, the lack of scouting is what allows you to break it and not automatically lose. So that's what enables people to make the decision to break a Nash equilibrium. Is the fact that they have the chance of not being detected doing it for long enough that it's too late for the opponent to respond. So we have what's called a blind counter, but that typically only applies to the early game, and that's things like going 3 hatch before pool and getting cannon rushed.
But that's something you can technically
I think,
scout.
yeah, the thing is,
I mean,
well,
it can.
depends
I mean,
on
it can
how
be counted.
players choose to play. There's a difference between actually choosing to play a certain way, which arguably takes skill in StarCraft. That's why StarCraft players are sometimes also good poker players, because there are parallels. And just being in a situation where you're just kind of dead, you know?
Right.
Like it can, as in, again, Legacy of the Void Ultras, Immortals against Mech, we've gone over that.
Well, like okay, so like
So
talking
there's
about
a difference between an action that a player chooses to take as far as strategy, maybe within a best of X series, or he likes to play ladder in a certain way or whatever, and things that are forced by the units themselves. I think it's an important distinction to make.
Okay, so let's get into unit design for a minute here then, because
Sure.
that seems to be something Teo wants to talk about.
all right.
So we have discussing it in context of the Nash equilibrium because the Nash equilibrium is probably the most important game theory concept to determining balance and how the game behavior should play out. And since as a game designer, wants to enable lots of options and decisions and possibilities for strategy game, but they also should have in mind a way they want the standard gameplay to go when they're designing the game. And that's what the Nash equilibrium should be. So the Nash equilibrium. So when we say standard, what's the standard play, or so on and so forth. What's the that's typically describing what the Nash equilibrium is what's standard. Is another way of explaining that. And so, unit design as it relates, for example, the adapt we can look at right now in Legacy of the Void for Protoss. They pretty much just make mass adapts early on until they can't and try to make that work and try to get ahead and win games with just mass adapts. They don't really make zealots anymore because zealots are only slightly cheaper. You just kind of go mass adapt until you either win or you die, or you can eventually transition. And that's because there's a lot of overlap between the adept and the zealot. They're both short range, they're both high damage, they're both high durability, except that the adept is only very slightly more expensive, has better damage against light units, and is significantly more mobile, at least before charge. So there's really no reason to make that unit. So you have a higher win percentage chance making adepts instead of zealots, and that's a unit design problem because zealots become obsolete by design because you have another unit at the same tech level. It's not really a hard counter issue per se,
I think there's more important things to look at though, as far as unit design, as in I think the Ultralisk is a better example of how you design a game and how you Blizzard is looking at Legacy, where players would like to say, okay, we can't deal with Ultras because Marauders are bad, whatever, just give us something, improve Marauders, make Ultras harder to reach, which arguably give players more chances to do things and distinguish themselves because it's still a competitive game, as opposed to just a ghost skill. You just need the ghost at X timing or you're dead. Again, I keep coming back to this thing of you either do one action or you don't win. Or instead of rather than doing one action, it's just you either mass one unit or you don't win. I think that's the bigger problem as far as unit design goes in Legacy. And
Okay.
it kind of happened in some situation in Heart of the Swarm PvZ especially, where for every one Zerg unit, Protoss was forced to go into another unit, and that kind of felt frustrating to play for lots of people. Like, you needed Colossus against Swarm Host, you needed Phoenix against Mutas and whatnot.
Right. So
And then
that's
players... one more thing. In fact, players actually tried to find the best way to move away from that and have something that could kind of always work in most situations, which was the 3-base blink, really.
okay. I agree with you, everything you said. So that definitely, absolutely did happen. But the thing to point out there, though, is that in an asymmetrical game like StarCraft II, given the fact that certain races have strength advantage, and in every matchup, one race at a certain timing is going to be the aggressor against their opponent, and there's not really much you can do about that. But the way map control works, the way the unit design and the timings work out, there will be times during each matchup where one race is required to be the aggressor, unless their opponent deliberately cedes the aggression, deliberately gives it up by a decision they make. And as long as things like that exist, sometimes players will be forced into a certain decision whether they want to do it or not, or they lose, and that's just a byproduct of having an asymmetric game.
Yeah, but I think there's a difference between having a way to react to certain things, and the need to make a specific tech or unit. Because one thing is positioning your units properly to deal with an attack or whatever. Another is if you don't have this unit at this time, your build is bad or is unsafe or whatever, because you really feel forced by the developer themselves to play in a specific way and with specific things, rather than allowing players to come up with solutions.
Yeah, I think. Can I just comment on that real quick? Like, I think of that definitely when I think about, like for instance, you mentioned PVT, and if the like SCV pool is like so scary that the optimal strategy for Protoss, pretty much the only real choice they have, is to sit on two bases with their army in like exactly one place. And there's really not.
Yeah, I disagree with that. There's lots of ways to deal with SCV pools. Actually, there's just SCV pools in particular are kind of interesting because they're one of those builds that constrict a matchup and kind of dictate the rules of the matchup. There's been lots of them, like 1-1-1 in Wings, Roach Max. There are things that you need to account for, or you can choose to not account for it if you're metagaming someone or whatever. Like if you were playing against Aegis, you don't care about SCV pools because you
so with regards to what you said, that's breaking a Nash equilibrium for metagame reasons. Knowing your opponent won't do something means you can do something suboptimal to counter what you expect him to not do, so on and so forth. So
I don't think you can boil it to optimal or suboptimal. In case of SCV pools, you can go Storm faster. That's actually really good for you if he does an SCV pool. It's just taking a gamble, I guess, which can be...
What I'm saying is you are then assuming that your opponent is not going to do the optimal response to what you're doing, which would be the SCV pull. And that's breaking a Nash equilibrium.
I guess. The point is, dealing with SCV, like SCV pools, when people first started using them, looked so strong that people stopped opening Colossus. This was before the mine.
Right.
Despite the fact that Colossus openers were actually better against them then.
Exactly. Well,
well, sort of. Once you got good at force fielding and like using your stalkers to avoid the Vikings picking off your Colossus,
it's not just that. Well. It's having the exact amount of probes. It's having the exact amount of Colossus, the exact amount of gates, taking the gases out your third at the right time, the right amount of upgrades. There's a lot of little things that go into holding an SCV pool that maybe most people don't pick up on, or maybe they do, I don't know. But I think that's actually a more interesting...
Terran.
Yeah, but it's an interesting situation in that there's lots of little things that players can do to hold an SCV pool or not. Like if I went to play on ladder now on my shitty unranked account or whatever, I would hold SCV pools from platinum players easily because I can macro. But if I was to play against an actually good player, I wouldn't.
I mean, I think
Makes
the
any sense.
problem that I
So-
feel in StarCraft II is a lot of times you're kind of forced into situations where you don't really have much of a choice as to what you're doing, and you end up playing very, very similar games over and over. Like if we look at,
I don't agree. I think like if you look at TVZ, which is arguably the best matchup, it's also the matchup with the least variance in unit compositions. Like each side has one or two different unit compositions. Terran has bio or mech. Zerg has either mutas or some kind of Roachling into Roachling Bane into Roach Hydra, whatever kind
Or
of
they also have
build.
Ling Infest or Ultra, but
Yeah, but that's later on in the game. You know, as far as the first 15 minutes, they're actually all very similar. Yet, it's considered the best matchup in StarCraft. And I hate to say this, but if you look at Brood War, the Brood War builds aren't very... Yeah, I went there. The Brood War builds
It
don't
took you
have
more than
that
half an
much
hour, though.
variance. But people like... Yeah, I know, I was good. But people like Brood War. It's a great game to watch, even though the games aren't all that different. You don't need a million different units being viable to have a game that's fun to play and watch. In fact, PvZ in Heart of the Swarm is less good, even though basically every unit is viable. So it's not just a question of having different units every game. It's more complex than that. It's what those units do.
Yeah. So going back to bring it back to unit hard counters for a moment, like unit X countering unit Y. From a game design perspective, that's actually okay to have that in the game and have it work fine, as long as you constrict the context in which it occurs. Because take, for example, because it's one of the ways you stop people from just massing a single unit is by giving their opponent a unit that they can just counter that unit with. So siege tanks get hard countered by immortals. Even Legacy of the Void, if you just go only siege tank, your opponent can still kill you even with the worst immortals. But the thing is that you don't just make siege tanks, so that it's okay that immortals counter siege tanks. At least theoretically, in practice in Heart of the Swarm, mech wasn't designed very well, but it's okay that immortals counter siege tanks because you don't only make siege tanks. You can also make Hellions to block for them or Hellbats. You can also make Widow Mines to do some good damage to them. You can make some. You could theoretically make Ravens to Seeker Missile the Immortals because it's hard to run away from Seeker Missiles with Immortals. There are so many different theoretical things you can do. It just so happens that Protoss also has other responses to those things, which overall has the side effect of making mech not very good. But it's not the immortal versus siege tank interaction exclusively that makes mech not very good in TVP.
Yeah, sure. The thing is, again, looking at Brood War, it's actually fine to have like really situational unit that only counter a few things. For example, again, going to Brood War because yes, I can. I started it. If you look at Valkyries in TVZ, they basically only work against mutas mostly. And they're not very much used, but the few times someone uses them, it's interesting because they're rare. You don't know what's going to happen because it's a bit of a different game, whatnot. So, like, a hard counter can be interesting as long as it's not, in my opinion, what the entire game is based around. If you look at the Vikings... If you look at Vikings against Colossi, and Vikings are interesting in other situations, but against Colossi specifically, the Terran only makes them to fight a Colossus army straight up. They can choose to not do it or whatever.
That's true. Yeah, it's like you make the Vikings, they counter the Colossus, and then like you have no use for the Vikings at all at that point.
It's not. It's not just that though. Well, you can. It's not just that though. It's that it's the only way you have to fight a Colossus army straight up. You either do that or you delay Vikings and try to attack in 2 to 3 places and whatnot. So, but if you do want to fight, it is very binary.
Right. So it's okay if units are very situational, and that's great that you have units that are situational. One of the hallmarks of Terran design in StarCraft II is that the Marine is the catch-all unit of the bio ball of the bio strategy. It's good in every situation. Having Marines is never a bad thing. And then every other unit you add into that composition is situational. You add Marauders if your opponent's making a bunch of armored units that are good against Marines, or you need units that are more durable. You add the Ghost to counter your opponent's spellcasters, or like the High Templar, etc. Or if they're, remember in Wings of Liberty the old Ghost rushes for the all-ins that people would do, so that you'd
Yeah.
EMP the sentries.
Yep. I remember
so
that very well.
Yeah, it's like on like Shakura's Plateau.
Yep.
You can you add every the Marine is the core of your army. You just make lots of Marines. But every other unit
Yeah,
you
but
add
that's
into
fine.
that composition is situational, and that's actually a perfectly valid and wonderful design for a strategy. There's absolutely nothing wrong with that from game design perspective. The issue is if that is as a main strategy it's like has too high a win rate, and therefore counters what your opponent's optimal strategies are against that.
Well, what you're saying is that
Or if
it's
your
a problem
opponent,
if terrain is imbalanced. Like, yes, it is.
well,
But
I'm
doesn't
saying
happen.
it's a problem if there's one strategy Terran has that is just too good against everything your opponent can throw at it. But
Of course.
or if like one specific option is. But there's nothing wrong with having situational units that are very good against other units, as long as the
Yeah, sure.
overall composition you wind up at is reasonable. Like a
And I
single
think
unit is perfectly.
And I think you also want to have other options. If like for again, instead of looking at Brood War PvZ, they added the Viper pull to give Zergs more options to do stuff against the Colossus, and I think that worked very well because Colossus are just kind of boring units, and so now
No, I mean that's
it's
just
fine.
a.
Yeah, they're
There's
pretty. They're not very exciting, but it's nice that instead of having Corruptors, they have the choice of going Hive and Vipers, and that does other things because it opens different transitions. It can be used in different ways. It's not
So
like the
I'm gonna
Corruptor
take
where
the,
you use it once and then it's pointless because you can't even land a Corruptor. But
Vipers are amazing.
So
I
I'm
don't
actually
know.
going to take the other standpoint on the Colossus. I'm going to play devil's advocate for a minute here. I think the
no, that's
Colossus is a fantastic unit design for one main reason. The fact that it is boring is good. Because when every unit in the game is stand out and really fun and interesting, not all of them begin to feel boring and trite after a while. Stalkers are so great with blink and mobility because you can look at all the other units and say, well, I really like Stalkers because of this and that and so on and so forth. You can't have every single unit you have be stand out and have wonderful activated abilities or whatever.
I
Otherwise, it
agree,
all winds
but
up just feeling like a gigantic mash of random stuff going on.
I
of course,
disagree.
I actually agree
Um,
with what White Wing said. But the one issue I have is that the Colossus isn't a basic unit. It's a tech unit. It's an expensive unit. You only see 3 or 4 at a time. I think that kind of unit is better if it's a little more exciting, like High Templar. Like the greatest PvTs ever played usually are High Templar based games, not Colossus games for a reason. As if you want to look at basic infantry units like Roaches, Marauders, Stalkers, it's okay if they're a little boring. It's perfectly fine. I don't have a problem with those. But when it's A, an expensive unit, and B, the core unit in a lot of situations for a race, that's when you have kind of an issue as far as unit design goes. And the specifics of the Colossus itself, i.e., it can be hit by flying units, opened up a whole can of worms as far as hard counter goes because of Corruptors and Vikings and whatnot.
So let's bring this back to hard counters for a second. So
It kind of
we
goes back
agree
to
that
that though. Like, it's the very nature of the Colossus to require a hard counter because it's big. It can be hit by flying units. The automatic response was let's make flying things that hit the Colossus specifically.
right, and I mean there's no harder. I mean from a unit on unit perspective, there is no harder counter to a unit than a unit that can attack it but it can't attack back.
Yeah,
So
of
there's
course.
no harder counter. So like a roach is hard countered by a void ray. The roach can't defend itself. The void ray kills it really fast. There's really not much else there to it. But I mean, you can also take the context of the strategy in the game as a whole. Because if anyone saw TSL 3,
Yes.
you remember Mondragon versus Xerax.
Yeah, greatest series ever.
So Xerax is just making mass void rays in Phoenix. And Mondragon's like, you know what? I'm only gonna make roaches, and then just killed him. Because he just made so many roaches so fast that the void rays couldn't kill them quickly enough, and all of Xerax's probes and buildings died.
Chris, have you seen that series?
No. That sounds
Basically,
sounds beautiful. That's how I play ZVP, bro.
It was at the height of Colossus Void Ray imbalance, right? And Xerox was this Protoss who only had good PvZ basically, and only would go Colossus Void Ray every PvZ ever. Mondragon, and at the time Zergs had no idea. Mondragon was this legendary Brood War Zerg that was invited to TSL only because he won another TSL in Brood War.
Or he came in
And no
second
one-
place in the TSL2, right?
Yes. Yeah,
Tononi,
he got second to Noni, so he got invited in TSL3, and no one knew what he was gonna do. And he showed up with this crazy build, which was a Roach Max with drops, and it just took Xerox apart completely, and it was glorious.
Wonderful.
And
he just said, you know what? Your unit counters the Roach, but you can't have enough of them to counter this many Roaches that quickly. And he just rammed Roaches down Xerax's throat until Xerax was just a husk of a former player in the game.
I'm gonna be honest. That's basically how I played ZVP.
I think that's actually a great situation though, because it allows player creativity, because no one had seen mass Roach Max with drops before.
Well,
that.
I mean that's what I'm saying though, because I'm saying
And
like
it
even though the
overcame
unit's
imbalance.
hard counter, even though in a vacuum scenario of a Void Ray having to kill a Roach, like the Void Ray hard counters the Roach as hard as possible. It's in the context of the actual gameplay itself, the Void Ray doesn't necessarily always hard counter the Roach.
Yeah, it's actually
but
kind of an
that's-
interesting situation because it becomes a strategic decision from the players. From a tactical point of view, the battles aren't exciting. The Void Rays shoot there, stand there and shoot. The Roaches try to kill as much stuff as they can. But strategically, it's brilliant. It's like when Terrans found out that they could skip Vikings against Colossus or Ghosts against Templar and just make as much bio as they could, and they would try to kill you in 15 minutes.
Thanks,
or die trying.
Maru.
Thanks, Maru, exactly. But that's actually very interesting because it opens up choices for players. The issue, again, I have is it sucks when one of those choices is, well, if you actually want to win a straight-up fight, you still need this unit. Specifically, you need these many of these units. That's,
So
I think,
it sounds like your
fine.
complaint isn't. It sounds like your complaint isn't that isn't the fact that the hard counters exist in the game and that because context can make that okay. Your problem is that it's not a question of hard countering. It's that sometimes you are forced into where your highest percentage where your highest percentage option is like a 50% move, and it requires you to do because you don't have any other options that are 50%. You'll have like one option, and it's only like a 50% move. Like it's only about gets you to an even position if you do it, and if you do anything else, you just lose.
Yeah, and
Yes.
that option requires a specific unit composition, which plays in a specific way. Like Vikings are only good for straight-up attacks in PvT. They cannot do anything else. They're
Well, sure they can. There are other things they can do. You can sit them outside your base for warp prisms and defend locations.
okay, but that's
Gumiho used to harass
very
throw blinds with them.
situation. That's okay. If you can sneak a group of Vikings in, you can probably afford a big fucking Doom drop.
Well, I mean,
So you would
just because-
rather get the Doom drop
just
in
because
his
it's not
base.
because it's not the best unit you have for harass. It's the unit you have available that you had to make. But there's more than one thing you can do with it. And I'm perfectly okay with the idea of being forced to make a unit of some kind, like Unit X, as long as there's more than one thing you can do, as long as you have more than one option to employ Unit X. Like if like one of the old things
but
people
those
used to do is
things
they
you
didn't
said-
want to make is that players didn't used to want to make units that they didn't need, but they would try to figure out ways of avoiding making the unit because there was nothing else they could do with them. So, like, if you think about early game, you don't want to make a whole bunch of Zerglings early, because if you make a whole bunch of Zerglings early, you could have had drones instead, and you've got nothing to do with those Zerglings. They just sit there doing nothing. But if you have something you can do with the Zerglings, it becomes a much better decision. Like if you can pick off rocks to get a gold base earlier or something. Or open backboard paths, and making those links becomes maybe not a good decision, but a better decision.
I don't see how that
so-
has to do with counters. So sorry, I got distracted.
Oh, okay. Well, it's the idea is that it's okay to be forced to make a unit in a low percentage situation in order to make it an even situation, as long as that unit has more than one thing you can do with it. As long as it's not a paperweight after the situation's over. Or as long as you're not forced into just one thing you do. So like with the Viking, you might only be able to use it in the straight up engagement, and then win the engagement and then counterattack for a win of the game. So you're forced to make Viking, so that doesn't feel fun. But if you could, then harass. But if instead of use it in the engagement. If the engagement doesn't come, you can then harass with it, or you can patrol around the map and pick off observers with a Raven, or theoretically there are other things you could think of to do with the Vikings that would be useful to do. Then it becomes a less irritating force.
That's kind of a slippery slope, though, because as I was saying, it's fine to have situational units. Like if you imagine a game where having anti-air stuff for Terran is useful, but again, I'm thinking of Brood War, but I shouldn't be doing this. Like in some situation, it can be you're in a fight, you're Terran, you kill 4 Colossi with your Vikings. Now you don't know what to do because it takes a long time for the Protoss to build a bunch of Colossus again. That's different from you're a Terran, you're in a fight, you kill all these Templar, you have 5 ghosts left. Now you can EMP his reinforcements. There you can, or maybe you can back out and come back later for a fight, but not that much later. Whereas with Vikings specifically, it feels like you kind of end up sitting there doing nothing for a long time, which you don't want to do as Terran.
We can talk about like Corruptors for sure. Like Corruptors, like what do you do with Corruptors after they kill Colossus? Like
that's the problem for Corruptors, more so than Vikings, I guess.
Yeah, like you can just cast corruption on everything. That really just doesn't do that
How
much.
many Wings of Liberty games have Zergs lost in 2011 because they had 15 Corruptors, they killed all 3 Colossi, and then they were like, there's 50 Linkstalkers here. Problem.
I beat Fire Zerg in a tournament to do it because of that. Well, back when he was actually on Complexity,
nice.
And I was like a low-level Masters player. I actually won the tournament, got all the way to the finals, and then the final game, like I tried to cheese it with the 2-base Stargate Rush. It should be a 1-base 2 Stargate Rush. Like I banked minerals and stuff for a while just so I could have like the 2 Void Rays coming out at the same time and surprise it with 1 extra, like half a minute sooner than I otherwise would have one. And he shut that down no problem. But then like later on in the game, like I just made like heavy immortal stuff. He came with a bunch of Corruptors to kill my 2 Colossus. I just killed all his ground army and I managed to get his Greater Spire before he made any Brood Lords. And he was like, "Crap! Now I've got these 20 Corruptors floating here."
Yeah. So back on topic again. Those things are the thing is, again, that would be fine if making a Corruptors against something else was a choice. Like for example, if the Corruptor was something that makes you a little stronger in straight up fights than a Viper, for example. Who's the guy with the angry rant? I'm not ranting yet.
He had a brief one earlier. Okay, if you want to set him loose, we can set him loose.
Anyway, it would be fine if, say, the Corruptor makes you a little stronger in a straight up fight, but then it's less useful later, as opposed to hypothetical unit Y that makes you a bit weaker in a straight up fight, but is more versatile. And then you have choice.
Whatever you do, don't mention those things, please.
Chris, don't do that.
Yeah, I mean, the idea with Blizzard was going with behind the Corruptor was that you'd make Corruptors to kill air units, and then you turn them into Broodlords if you didn't need them anymore. The problem with that design compared to
as easy.
Brood War. Well, yeah, but I'm agreeing with you. The problem with Brood War, comparing that to Brood War, which had a very similar unit design, was that the Mutalisk was just all around more useful and had more options than the Corruptor.
Yeah.
So if you were in a situation where you couldn't turn them into Guardians, which were basically the Brood War equivalent of Broodlords, you could just keep them as mutants and fly around and keep killing shit, or just
Guardians themselves were interesting because they were a lot more. I guess they were more situational, but they were also a very strategic choice. Like if you could set your mutas behind a natural, you could siege that natural, and that's all the Guardians would do. You would never see Guardians flying on the open field like Broodlords as a
Guardians were just playing worse unit than Broodlords. Like in terms of just unit comparison, they were just a lot weaker.
They were different. From guy in chat, they were different, and they sucked at their fights, but they were more interesting strategically.
Like there's nothing a Guardian could do that a Broodlord couldn't do just as well. But the fact that you got to the Guardian with a much more useful unit, you made the Guardian a much more situational unit, whereas Broodlords are just kind of all around good.
Yeah, exactly.
And that made the Guardian a more so basically the Guardian and Broodlord could be thought of less of as its own unique unit, and more of as an ability of the Mutalisk. Because it was so situational, you only used it when you wanted to get a high ground, get a terrain advantage, and just siege one location.
Pretty much like a siege tank upgrade for the Mutalisk. It roots itself behind the natural and just sieges it, right?
Yeah, and then it can't turn back, so you're just essentially sacrificing the Mutalisk for that temporary advantage. But
Wait, did I miss
it's-
something?
What?
I-
Oh no, never mind. Okay, sorry.
Hi, welcome.
But in terms of the hard counters of the units, there's nothing inherently wrong with having a unit that hard counters another unit, as long as the context is also taken into account. Because the existence of hard counters is what prevents people from massing a specific unit and then just steamrolling their opponent. Like if there was no hard counter to the carrier, and you could figure out a way to get to mass carriers, what is your opponent going to do to you?
Yeah, of course, but as you said, the key thing is the whole environment and situation,
Well, actually, hold on, back up. I want to
which is yeah.
I just want to say I think it's actually terrible unit design to have something that always works better when it's masked. Like if I hate to use Brood War comparisons, but like if we go back to Brood War, for instance, like bio in that game was not that good. I mean, Marines themselves are actually pretty good.
No. Bio was amazing. Well, I don't know what you're talking about.
Against
It was
Zerg.
situation. Oh,
Right.
but yeah,
It was against
or
Zerg.
Protoss.
You used
in low
really good
numbers,
against
it was amazing. Like in low numbers, it was like absolutely incredible. But like once you got to a certain like critical mass, like it really just stopped becoming useful because of
That's
the way
because
that-
it was fucking impossible to control it, though. It wasn't the units themselves.
Well, it
Like, if
wasn't
you-
just that it was impossible to control. It was because the Reaver existed. Like you made mass bio, like a Reaver would just kill like 20, would just, like,
Well,
kill 20
we're
Marines
talking-
with one Scarab shot. But
Yeah, but see,
We're
that was a good
see,
interaction still. Like that's
Or like
that's like a hard counter, quote unquote. But
it
like
wasn't
that's a
just
good
that.
interaction.
It wasn't as simple as the Reaver existed. In fact, there were some 2-base PVT bio-based timings. But
right,
I
but
don't think
they ended before the high tech came out. But it's the thing.
Yeah.
I mean, there's not scalability of hard counters is actually a really good point to bring up. It's you scale unit scaling is an important thing to think. How well does this unit do in small numbers? How well does it do in medium numbers? How well does it do in large numbers? How well does it do
but
when
again-
synergized with other units in those numbers? And how well does the response to the response strategies deal with that unit? And how do the response units and strategies change to that unit given the scaling and given how many of them there are? So like Marine scaling changes dramatically. The more Marines there are. Like in low numbers, you can easily deal with them with just Stalkers. In middling numbers, you can deal with them with Stalker, Zealot, Sentry, and maybe a Colossus. In big numbers, you need like a lot of Colossus or High Templar. Sentries you want like a Sentry for Guardian Shield, but Force Fields become way less useful because Medivacs get added.
Yeah, I really dislike
So
that, to be honest.
Yeah, it's scaling is game design is a very useful thing to have because it straight scaling is always going to be a factor. Units are always going to scale well unless you specifically design the abilities to be unusable along with each other. Like if you remember the Heart of the Swarm beta, or before the beta, the alpha, they had this unit called the Shredder.
Oh
Which-
yeah.
Oh, yeah.
They wanted to
Shredder.
destroy this. They deliberately intended for it to be unscalable because they made it not work if you had other units nearby.
Yeah, I remember
And that I think, that's pretty much the only way you can deliberately deliberately could go out of your way to avoid having scaling. You have to do something drastic like that because every unit is unique. And there are always going to be some units that scale unless every unit has something like that in it.
Can I just talk about how much I love the Viper? Like a lot of people like hate on the Viper. Like Legacy of the Void Viper is a piece of shit, but Heart of the Swarm Viper I think is actually probably one of the best designed units that Blizzard's made in Starcraft II. And the reason why I love it is because like it has a lot of versatility. Like for instance, like Teo was saying, you can go Vipers instead of Corruptors, and they will still deal with a similar situation. But also in the fact that like they're really not useful when you mass them because you have to, like with the Abduct and the Blinding Cloud, like you have to have other things nearby to actually help it.
Well, yeah, they solved the Viper scaling issue by making them cost 4 supply and not having any form of damage dealing ability whatsoever.
Yeah, I love
It's not
Vipers.
just that, though.
Vipers are
Like-
amazing.
But I mean, there's
it's
so
not just that, though. Like, High Templar can't be must either, even though they do ridiculous amounts of damage.
Well, because they run
So
out of
it's a
energy and then
situation-
can't do damage anymore, and they're squishy. But it's, I mean, you can
Yeah.
no, you can totally theoretically mass. Theoretically, there's nothing inherently wrong with the notion of massing High Templar, going out, storming the crap out of everything, and then turning them into Archons after, then finishing off the opponent from all the damage you with Storm. The problem is that it's so obscenely gas expensive that you can't afford to do it. And because there are also a lot of good responses that can just tank storms, like it's nothing.
And
But,
I
I
remember
mean-
back when I was in Gold League and I played somebody who like I just let him sit for like 30 minutes and he just had like 30, 40 High Templars in his army.
I mean, like, if you-
I just lost him. I was so mad.
Nice. By
Like,
the
if
way,
you just- if you
Superman
just
has a good
imagine-
question. In
yeah,
terms
I
of
saw the
countering
question.
okay. Want to talk about that?
We'll talk about it in just a minute. I just wanted to finish up the scaling discussion.
Go ahead.
Mhm.
So I mean, how well a unit scales with itself and with other units it synergizes matters quite a bit towards the notion of countering it. Counters change dramatically, and your Nash equilibrium strategy, your optimal strategy as a response to the scaling of your opponent's units changes dramatically based on how many of them are, and not just the tech involved. Because you deal with 200 Marines very differently than you deal with 10 Marines. Against 10 Marines, you can just make a few stalkers and you can kite and deal with that. No big deal. Against 200 Marines, even 100 stalkers isn't going to deal with 200 Marines very well. It's you can also you mix the strategies in the synergies with other units. Medevacs Marines is very different than just purely Marines. So you can a unit countering another unit is fine, but you got to absolutely take into account how many of the unit counter how many of the other unit.
Definitely.
And because the question of how many units are there and how expensive and how difficult it is to get that many of it makes it a much more complicated notion of counters than just X unit counters Y unit.
Right.
Okay. So yes, we can focus on Superman's question now. I think that's actually an excellent question, and John, you can just go ahead and read that and give your own thoughts.
I think Noni said this once, where he basically, as for Protoss specifically, as long as the Colossus itself works the way it does, it's just really hard to go carriers, because like you can't have carriers being as good as the Colossus because they do reasonable good siege damage or whatever, and they have anti-air. So if they had really good anti-air, they would counter their own counter, if that makes any sense. Because in SC2, the way to beat the Colossus is Vikings and Corruptors. So yeah, it definitely is an issue for Protoss specifically. I think for carriers, for battle cruisers, I think the reason you don't see them is simply that they are fucking expensive and they don't fit in any Terran build, mostly. Maybe mech, but even mech, you do other things before battle cruisers.
I kind of hate the way their DPS works. That's just me personally.
There was a...
Oh, you should read the question.
Yeah, Chris, could you just read the question?
All right.
And then give your own thoughts?
Oh, Superman's?
Yeah, the
countering
one on
anti-air.
anti-air.
Okay. In terms of countering anti-air, what do you think of the dynamics of countering it with ground units, Goliath versus carrier, and countering with air units, Viking Corruptor versus anti-air? I feel like in StarCraft II there aren't battle cruisers and carriers because they're too easy to be destroyed by anti-air units. I think, like, honestly, if like we really trace things back, I think a lot of mistakes were made in Wings of Liberty, and we kind of balanced around that. So I mean, I won't go off on a rant, but like I think everything in Terran is kind of balanced around the Marauder and not the Siege Tank, and that pisses me off. But I think when I read something like this, I think about we have Broodlord Infestor and things like that, and Air in Wings of Liberty was really strong. I think in a lot of ways, Blizzard kept trying to give options for anti-air to us to try to like counter things, and it really kind of shut down a lot of the capital ships that we see in play.
His question specifically was related not to the notion of anti-air, but to anti-air air units like the Viking. I think he made an interesting point that the ground unit versus air unit dynamic is the strategic notion, or the game design notion behind that is that air units can ignore terrain, where ground units can't. Therefore, they are more mobile. Therefore, they have to be a little bit weaker, or more expensive, one of the two, or both, in order to compensate for their improved mobility over ground units and their ability to reach places ground units can't.
Right.
So the fact that I'm not even going to do this now. I was going to say something Brood War related. I'm not going to do it. You can. I'll make a
That's my
StarCraft
job.
2 comparison. You can take the, say, Marine. Okay, you can kill air units with a Marine, or you can kill air units with a Viking. With the Marine fighting air units, because you have to stim up and run directly underneath the air units to really do enough damage to kill them, or you can just poke at them from a good long range away with the air unit. There's nothing inherently wrong with having a long range ground unit like a Thor doing the job. But the problem with using the Thor compared to even with the special ability, which is basically equivalent to having a ground Viking, his special one long 10 range, like high damage single target cannon thing, his ability he has. The problem is that the Thor can do that, but why would you bother using a Thor for that when you can have a Viking, which basically functions exactly the same way, except that it has significantly superior mobility. And I think that's an excellent point. Is that the optimal response to an air unit is a unit that is either equally mobile and beats it, or a unit that is less mobile but beats it handily.
Fair enough.
And in StarCraft II, we have a lot of air units that beat other air units and are just as mobile, but we don't have a lot of ground units that beat air units handily.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, I think that like makes me think of the magic boxing with the Thors, which I understand is like an idea to like make it so that there's counterplay to Thors and things like that. But the problem is like Thors just don't kill Mutalisks, which is what they're kind of designed to do.
Well, Thor. I'm actually quite happy with the fact that Thors don't beat Mutas on their own, because the Thor Marine composition does deal with Mutalisks very well. Because Marines, if in a straight up fight, murder Mutalisks like it's nothing.
Yeah.
Yeah,
So the
Mutas
idea is
aren't
that
an
the Thor
issue.
is basically like a long range weapons platform that protects the Marines and prevents the Mutalisks from diving in and out and picking units off. Because every time they do, they take a big Thor volley. But the Marines protect the Thor from the Mutalisks diving the Thor. So the Thor kind of zones the Mutas out, and the Marines shoot them down if they ever try to kill the Thor. And then Zerg's response to that is to run Zerglings and Banelings in to kill the Marines off, and so that the Mutalisks can actually beat the Thors and then beat that. And so you wind up with a big composition versus composition unit, or army, which works out very well. The main problem with the Thor is that it's just a little bit too big. It's difficult to. It's not just slow; it's just a little bit too big. The Warhound would have been great if they'd gone with their original design of being a smaller Thor.
Yeah, I would have been okay with that.
Which is basically a Goliath.
Yeah. I mean, yes, it was basically
Blizzard,
Goliath that did splash
Blizzard doesn't
damage
make Brood War units in StarCraft II. Shh.
Bad.
Well, it's no secret that they're taking Brood War units and they're splitting them in other units. If that makes any sense.
No, they're just taking Brood War units out of the worker, right?
No, look. Look. The Vulture has become the Mine and the Hellion. The Goliath has become the Viking and or the Thor, sort of. Like, there's a lot of these examples. The Reaver has become the Disruptor and Colossus. The Dragoon has become the Stalker and Immortal. There's lots of situations like that. But yeah, regarding Superman's question, back to his original point, I think the reason we don't see battle cruisers is just they're really hard to get, period, and that's fine. Because when you do get them, they're powerful in every matchup. So, and that's again, it's fine. For carriers, it's a different situation because Protoss is so thought as reliant on the Colossus, and because the Colossus is there really. In fact,
it's also the fact that
reason
the carrier was just really bad until Legacy of the Void. Like, it just was awful.
Yeah. In fact, it's not. It's the reason they buffed the carrier and they felt like they could do it, I think, is because they destroyed the Colossus. So no one is ever going to go Corruptor or straight up Corruptor, Viking, whatever against Protoss. I don't think.
It's so. I think my answer to that question that he asked initially, regarding the late game super heavy units. So I talked to QXE a while back about this. We had a discussion regarding this. And he he pointed out that that in Wings of Liberty, Battlecruiser Raven for Terran was their ultimate endgame army, and it was better than any other unit composition Terran had by far. Dealing with that army was virtually impossible unless you hit like a godlike vortex with the mothership. It was just there was no good way of dealing with that unit composition, and Zerg had no response at all really. But the problem was that you couldn't get to the unit composition without dying because of how outrageously expensive it was and how much infrastructure you needed. So the thing was is that a starport is expensive, and it only builds one unit at a time, and it takes a long time to use it. So you either need a ridiculously large amount of time in order to build that air fleet on a small number of starports, or you need an obscenely large amount of money in order to build that many starports to build that many air units. And that's such a ridiculously rare situation that you just never saw that army. But to his question again, in Wings of Liberty, I remember seeing the occasional game where battlecruisers did get used against Protoss, in addition to a bio army. I remember seeing a Terran player, I think it was Ryung. I distinctly recall it being Ryung, again on Calm Before the Storm in a GSL game. I could be wrong about it being Ryung. He made a bunch of. He was going bio, and he wasn't able to kill his opponent because that map was so heavily Protoss favored. It was, beyond belief how Protoss favored that map was.
Right.
But he was beating his opponent, but it wasn't enough to win the game because of the map, and he couldn't ever actually tack into him properly. So he added in some battle cruisers against the Protoss late game composition, and the battle cruisers soaked up so much damage that he actually managed to win in a straight up engagement. They just functioned as like flying tanks.
Like giant
that
PDDs.
didn't really do a lot.
That's what I used to call battle cruisers. And
he deliberately Yamato'd the rocks on the map to dump the energy so they couldn't just be feedback for a lot of damage, and then he just used them as flying siege. It's like just giant tanks in the sky to soak damage, and that to me was
their tanks.
Yeah, that was really cool to me because it was a use for the unit that didn't rely on the unit being good in large numbers or being the primary component of the composition. It was filling a support role as a battlecruiser, and that was really cool. We didn't see much of that though because it was so rare back then to get into a situation where the Terran was capable of getting the unit out and also needed to get the unit out for that purpose. Most maps were not in Protoss's favor to that degree that Terran needed that to win from that position. And you needed to have an advantage in order to buy time to get the battlecruisers out anyway. So it was pretty rare that you could get the advantage to get them out and then not finish the match off without building them. But I do think he has a point with regards to needing to anti-air air units being a little bit too good. Because
but the thing is,
and anti-air ground units not being quite good enough.
Yeah, but again, they had, I should say, to be too good to beat Colossus armies. So now that the Colossus has been nerfed, there might be room for battlecruisers and carriers. And
I mean, inherently they don't necessarily need to be that way because you could buff anti-air ground units. To compensate for the slight weakness of anti-air air units. But
well, with how the game has developed, specifically StarCraft, what do? Do you buff Marines? That's insane. Thor's
not Marines. Imagine you took the Thor, right? Imagine you took the Thor, and you put some higher damage on its secondary cannon ability. Well, I don't know that you
can say just that. Like, obviously we're theory crafting, but how does a Thor fit in a bio build? You're back to the situation of the Viking, where
it gets used in TVZ bio builds.
You get like 3 of them. I mean,
yeah. Well, imagine for a moment you needed 3 Thors to deal with your opponent's 3 Colossus. Like, I'm spitballing here. I'm not saying this is a good thing to do. I'm just saying, imagine this is the situation. So Terran builds 3 Thors to deal with the 3 Colossus. Suddenly the Viking doesn't have to be as good anymore to deal with them. I'm not saying this is the right way to do it. But the basic notion of the fact that anti-air air units have to be this good, when there could be some game design way you come up with to make anti-air ground units better, could therefore allow for a little bit better air units. So imagine, for example, if the Stalker had a better anti-air attack. Like, you wouldn't suddenly be forced to build Phoenix to respond.
I have dreams of that. I have dreams of that. I could cry.
It's firing as fast as a Marine, and you're like, oh my god.
Let's not get carried away. I'm okay with half as fast as a Marine. That would still be pretty good.
But I mean, like the problem with you were complaining about this earlier. against Mutas, if you want to play a longer game out against Mutalisks, you have to build Phoenix. They're the only response Protoss has to a large number of Mutalisks because. I mean, in Wings of Liberty, that was not the case because they didn't have the super fast regeneration rate. You could just storm them, and that would buy you a lot of time. But because of the regen buff they put on Mutalisks, you have to get Phoenix. There's nothing else you can do. You can delay for a while to get them out with Stalkers until the ball gets too big, but if you don't have Phoenix by then, you lose. So imagine if Stalkers necessarily were better against air units, theoretically. Maybe it wouldn't be necessary to be forced to build anti-air air units.
Yeah, but I think we're still coming back to the fact that yes, anti-air units are really good, but it comes down to the fact that Protoss was, until Legacy, very much so built around the Colossus, which is beaten by anti-air of some kind. And the easiest anti-air to build, to design, whatever, is Vikings and Corruptors. So
easiest to design, yes.
Hold on. Like the issue I have mostly is that Protoss is so centered around the tech unit, whereas if it was a support unit, you wouldn't have that problem, if that makes any sense. So in the Protoss army, the main unit is the Colossus, and then everything else supports it. Whereas in the Terran army, the core unit is a basic marine, and everything else supports a core infantry unit, as opposed to an expensive unit. I think that's the base issue. And it's easier to solve that, which they did in Legacy, by essentially removing the Colossus, or close to it, it looks like, than it is to start buffing all sorts of units, hoping to get the right numbers.
I mean, we can discuss forever. This may be a separate show we do at some point of how that got to be that way, why it was that way, and how it could be best fixed or whatever. I mean, obviously you can try to take it back to warp gates or any number of other problems, but you are correct. The core of the Protoss army is the expensive tech unit, and everything else supports them. Whereas with the Terran, the core is the Marine, and everything supports the Marine. And that makes a huge difference. And that's not necessarily a problem from a design perspective. As long as you fix a number of other contextual issues that go with it. And mainly the problem most people have with that is that the Colossus is boring. Like, if the Colossus wasn't boring, nobody would care that that's the case.
I don't know. I think I still don't like the idea of you need the Colossus period and everything else just protects it. Again, looking back, because that keeps you from being aggressive before you have X amount of Colossi and Blink Stalkers. It keeps you from actually having strong independent gateway units that allow you to be active with two groups of units on the map. It's like if you look at, say, the Templar games in PvT that people used to play, you were encouraged to split your Templar Zealot army because that was the opposite situation. Your core army was charged Zealots, and then Templar were support for that. And that just straight up worked well. As a player, I had more fun personally, and as a spectator, those games are just better. Like, look at Parting versus...
I really enjoyed the... back when it was viable, the composition of Sentry, Immortal, Templar, with then some Zealots, Archons, and other stuff mixed in. That was actually a really fun composition to play, where you just have to force field and storm well, and that army was really strong if you did it right, and then if you didn't, it just fell apart. But I mean, it didn't necessarily have to be that you had to have the Colossus in your core. I mean, obviously we had Templar built before the Mind buff, completely ruined them, but.
Yeah, no, what I'm saying is, if you compare the two, it's better to focus on a core infantry army, and then the tech units are support, than the other way around. Obviously, the only examples we have that I can think of is Colossus, Stalker versus Zealot Templar in PvT. I don't think there's many other particularly good examples of that.
There used to be Zealot Archon as a viable strategy.
Well, it's basically Zealot Templar, and Zealot Archon was really situational, and it was fucking terrible to stay on Archons as long as people did in 2011.
Well, it was an all-in mid-game. It was an all-in mid-game strategy where you tried to bait them into attacking, and then you killed them in the middle of the map. But
yeah, so that doesn't count. I guess it doesn't count as far as long. Yeah, but it wasn't all-in. It's like saying Zealot Sentry Stalker is exciting because you can 6-gate with it. You can, but it's not.
Well, I mean that's true, but we do need to discuss we do need to remember that there is the context of how many different options do you have. If you can use units in an all-in, then that's still a use for the unit. But I mean, as long as if you only have the one use for the unit, then that becomes too predictable. He sees it and then he knows what you're going to do and then stops it. So that's a problem. But
And then stops it is an important point though, because and then stops it implies you have an easy maneuver to stop that something, which
well, I
with
feel
some
like
builds isn't necessarily the case. Like it a lot of the time, even with all-ins, it comes down to player execution so much more than their builds. From soul trains to even like ridiculous Zealot Archon's builds where you just A move. It really comes down to choosing your fight, microing well with it, microing back a few units, whatever. There's a lot of little things that go into it that maybe people don't see. So it's not as binary as saying you see. It's never, I think, except with DTs, probably as binary as you see X unit and then you can instantly shut it down.
right, right. I didn't mean to suggest that. Yeah, but it's. I mean, if you imagine for a fact a moment that you see something, 5 minutes before the attack comes, like you see, like let's say that the only theoretical thing you can do with High Templar for a moment is to make Archons and all in with them. Let's just hypothetically say that's the case. So you scout the Templar archives, and then you've got like 3 minutes to 5 minutes before an attack comes. You know he has no choice but to do it because if he doesn't, you're just going to counter him and kill him later. So you have plenty of time to prepare for an all in and you stop it. That would be a serious problem. But if having the option to do an all in that's execution based is fine. As long as it's execution based, I don't see a problem with that, being that way. Because even if he scouts it, as long as you can outplay him, you beat him. But if he scouts it and knows how to respond and execute properly, you lose. I'm perfectly okay with that dynamic.
We're getting away from unit design, by the way.
Well, we're also getting away from hard counters a little bit, but
yeah, that's true.
I think we've covered most of it. I guess we should just take some questions for a while if anyone has them.
Yeah, that works.
So, I mean, the main things to take away is that, as we mentioned before, and anyone who missed it should go back and check it out. The Nash equilibrium basically just determines what standard play is, and the notion of a hard counter is not inherently problematic in any way, shape, or form, as long as it's not applicable during a Nash equilibrium, and that it only exists when somebody deliberately makes a suboptimal decision. Other than that, and as long as it's it exists along unit counters specifically designed to stop massing of a unit, then hard counters aren't necessarily problematic anyway, as long as it's not just something you just always go straight to. And that the problem people seem to have more is with being forced into a specific strategy at a time, rather than having a unit that just happens to be better at it than other units.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, okay. Fair enough.
All right, so if there are any questions...
Basically, you want to have units that counter each other, that's fine, but you also want to leave room for players to add their own skill on the game. So you want players to actually have freedom to do things rather than just the game being about getting a unit or an ability to deal with something.
All right.
All right, so
Patty
we
has
have
a question.
Couple questions from the... yep, go ahead.
Patty's question is, what is the most broken unit in the game, Teo?
Queens. Hands down, Queens.
Oh, okay. I actually didn't think about that.
I'm not going to answer that because it's outside the scope of the context of the discussion. No, I can't tell you what's the most broken unit. I honestly can't. There's way too much context that has to be considered to pick a single unit that's just more overpowered or more broken than anything else.
I'm gonna be honest. I personally think the Roach is like totally fucking OP. Like I remember learning.
Is it OP? Because it can be masked by Queens. See?
I mean that's the truth. It's the drone. It's the drone. Drone's too good.
Drone's too good.
It's the Queen's fault. It's the Queen's because...
Clearly the most broken unit in the game is the Zerg race selection button on the race selection screen. We have some questions from the Team Liquid strategy, the thread on Team Liquid.
Right.
One question that was asked is, how do you feel about or how do you believe the existence of hard counters affects the thought process by a game's balance team in terms of what to patch and when, in the general sense, but not referring to anything in particular. So how does the existence of hard counters as a notion determine how they patch things they've determined are a problem?
I think it's a very, very slippery slope because you can easily say, let's just make X unit counter Y unit and then this problem will go away, which is what they did with the Ghost and Legacy. But then people just don't like that mechanic for all the things we said in the past half an hour or whatever. And also the other thing is sometimes you can insert hard counters accidentally without meaning to. For example, the Widow Mine against Templar builds. So I think it's a very slippery slope, and they have to be very careful. And I would be surprised if they weren't really careful. But the game is just really unpredictable. You can't see how it will develop. So it's definitely something they have to be super mindful of. Otherwise, they just make mistakes without doing so, without even meaning to.
So
And then we
Blizzard,
yell at them.
yeah, Blizzard stated. Okay, so Blizzard's original path methodology was almost impossible to interpret, which is where we got jokes like, "Oh, time for a new patch. What change are they making to the bunker?" But it was almost impossible to really understand it. But their methodology developed to a point where they're getting a little bit better at it. And the basic idea is, what's the smallest possible change we can make that will impact the game in the way we want it to be impacted enough to make the difference we want to make different.
+1 queen range.
Yeah, that +1 queen range was a very minor change that had such a ridiculously large impact. It was incredible how much of an impact that minor change had, because they only had like 3 queens.
Except it wasn't minor. Everyone was yelling at it like the week it came out. I remember Lucky Fool posting a blog saying TVZ is no bullshit on TL.
Well, I mean,
it was like a wall of text and rage.
But take it out of context, though. So, out of context, +1 range to the queen does not seem like a very big game change. It's not giving it like +10 to damage. It's not giving it like an extra ability or modifying an ability in any significant way or making it produce 5 larva where inject. It's just +1 range on its attack, which doesn't even do that much damage. So that out of context, that seems like a very minor change, but it suddenly allowed queens to hard counter Hellion pressure. Or not necessarily hard counter, but actually, I would say during Wings of Liberty that making extra queens was in fact the highest 1% move you could do with Zerg against Terran.
Yeah.
By a very large amount. So in fact, making extra queens may have in fact actually been a hard counter to Hellion pressure, given how high the win percentage was when people made extra queens compared to not. But
True.
Well, I don't know. When they didn't make extra queens, they were going Roach Bane, and then when they went Roach Bane, it always worked because Terran was forced to cut corners. So basically, it always worked.
Basically, so what you're saying is Zerg hard countered Terran.
Yes. Well, no, extra queens.
At the end of Wings, at the end of Wings, it did.
But I mean, at the end of Wings, Zerg hard countered Protoss too. They just hard countered everything except. But they were a little bit overpowered at the time. But it's so the notion of hard counters. I mean, notion of hard counters is very important to game design in general. So if you're going to make a change to a game, it very much has to be taken into account.
Right.
So I guess that's my answer to that question. It looks like I don't know how to pronounce it. Edgewada has a question. How do you feel about Stalkers? They don't hard counter anything, but can be extremely good when masked up with some support, and they don't really straight up die to any single unit. Is it good design, or is the 50 Blink Stalkers equals Kill Zerg too much? My answer is that Stalkers are probably the best unit design in Starcraft II.
Yeah, they're one of the best for sure.
Yeah, because the thing is, that scenario you're describing implies a whole bunch of situations where the Zerg got outplayed before that.
Well, to be
honest,
honest,
it's not that the Protoss sits there, does nothing, makes 50 Blink Stalkers, and then it's an insta-win. You have to micro very well, you have to macro very well, you have to defend your third, you have to hit force fields in the first push, whatever. It's not just as simple as 50 Blink Stalkers, insta-win, no matter what the Zerg does. The Zerg needs to have lost the game before it reaches to that point.
I think really the issue when you end up in situations like that is really that's more the fault of Workgate than the actual unit, because like Stalkers.
Sometimes you don't need a proxy pile and you just win.
Yeah,
anyway.
I don't really want to get into the Warpgate discussion per se.
No, I'm just gonna say, but like I think Stalkers themselves are actually really well designed units, and they're really beautifully cost efficient. The problem is that like they tend to be a snowball unit just because you can continue making them and they keep getting more and more cost efficient the more you.
That's not necessarily true though. That's only true against Zerg and when you're winning.
Yeah,
I mean, they are against Terran too when you do the Blink Stalker all in. Like you start killing off bio units and then you just keep making.
Yeah, like that's where you end up in the like, oh my god, the mass Blink Stalkers just kills everything. That's I mean, it's a slow advantage.
I think it's a different situation because against Terran you still have a specific timing. Against Zerg, you can see games 25 minutes in that end up like that because of how Zerg units function against Blink Stalkers. Against Terran, you will never see mass Blink Stalker win 25 minutes in unless it's MC playing or something.
So it's the reason for that is Stalkers as a unit design are very high hit points for a unit of their cost and their supply, but very low damage output. Their DPS is one of the lowest in the game for actual combat units, and that fact means that engagements involving Blink Stalkers tend to last a while. And the longer the engagement is, the more the more time both players have to micro to gain advantages, and the more tricks and techniques, and the more time you have to make to retreat and then go back in after. And the length of time involved in an engagement is what allows players to demonstrate their skill. Terran units tend to have low hit points and very high damage output, especially bio units, and that effect means that even against Stalkers, they kill each other very quickly because the Terran units die to low DPS, but they kill high hit point units very quickly. So those engagements still are very slow. But Zerg units are also kind of lower DPS, more hit point units, kind of like Roaches, for example, are kind of low DPS, high hit points. So Stalker versus Roach engagement take a very long time to play out, and that means that Stalkers can micro very well. And you can show off the micro skills. You can do all sorts of fun tactics, and that's a fantastic thing. That's a good engage. That's a very good thing for the game. And Stalkers are also a very mobile unit. And mobility in a unit is what enables a wider range of strategic options.
Yep.
Zerglings are a cool unit because they can backstab. You don't have to take a straight engagement. You can backstab with Zerglings. The same thing goes for Stalkers. If you can't win a fight, you can harass it, blink away, and retreat. You can walk up, pick off 2 units, and blink back, and then run away, and then slowly whittle your opponent down. You can blink into your opponent's base, pick off some workers in a tech lab, and leave. Blinkstalkers have a ton of different ways of being used, and that's what makes them a good unit. A good unit, they're not a situational unit, but even as a non-situational unit, there's many different ways to show off their micro.
And another thing is, like, when a player wins a game, he will always snowball somehow at some point, whether that's mass Link Muta, mass Roaches, mass Blink Stalker, whatever. It just happens. It just so happens that in PvZ specifically, the last unit for Protoss to stay alive is usually the Blink Stalkers because they don't get focused like Colossus. They have more hit points than Sentries. They don't get, even Immortals end up getting focused a lot of the time. And Blink Stalkers don't. So that's just kind of how it works with Blink, but it's not an issue per se. I don't think. I think they're just a good overall unit.
I think they're great. Yeah.
My main gripe with the Stalker is
then
that
again,
there's
we're
no
all
other
Protoss.
unit. Well, I'm random now, but
so
there's no other. My main
right.
gripe with the Stalker. Hey, I play random on the Legacy. Okay. My main gripe with the Stalker is that it doesn't do very well against air units. It doesn't do nearly well enough against air units to and there's no other ground unit Protoss has that does well against air units. But there's not a problem with the Stalker per se. It's more a problem with the Protoss as a race.
Yeah.
Because you could easily give Protoss another unit that did well against air from the ground. But so yeah, that's our opinion about Stalkers. We have another question from the thread on Team Liquid.
Okay, go ahead.
What is your opinion on the state of having activatable abilities as hard counters?
So I personally hate that sort of thing. There was a while back. I think someone posted in like one of the responses Blizzard gave or something like that. That originally one of the design ideas for Starcraft II was they wanted to have more movers and shooters, quote unquote, rather than units with like a lot of activatable abilities and things like that. And just by the fact that you have something like a Marine or even like a Stalker, they're still more or less like movers and shooters. Like they kite, they run around, they kite, and they have interesting interactions with other things. You start stacking up abilities, like especially when you have one ability that counters another ability that counters another ability, etc., etc. Like it starts becoming this war of who can press buttons the fastest, and not really about the positioning of the units per se. So I don't like it at all. I wish
think it
we had more
depends.
positionally based units.
I think it depends a lot on the design of the individual skills. You can definitely, I think in Legacy we have way too many active spells. Like it feels like almost for every problem they try to introduce a new spell, and that's kind of going too far. But in limited situations, I guess it can work. I'm trying to think if there's any situation where that's a thing, and I like it. I guess Blink and Anti-Air is a good thing, but Blink is a good period.
Yeah. So the thing about activated abilities, and I'm gonna have a little bit of a different opinion. I don't have any problem with activated abilities whatsoever as a notion. My issue is that when you have every unit with an activated ability or too many of them, they become significantly less interesting. When everything is special, nothing is special anymore. And when activated abilities are how you show off on a unit's function all the time, and the unit relies exclusively on its activated ability at all times in all game stages, it becomes completely uninteresting to watch when it's not using the activated ability. So the Stalker, to go back to, it has quite a bit of play in it in the game and quite a bit of use before Blink is upgraded. You can kite Marines before Stim is done. You can poke forward and outrange and poke at bunkers. You can back off. You can defend bases with it. You can try to fight area units with it. There's all sorts of things you can do in the early game with the Stalker without Blink. But I mean, the High Templar is entirely activated abilities, and it's a great unit. There's nothing inherently wrong with activated abilities.
But that's just not a specific counter. It's just
I'm coming full circle. I'm getting there. It is a response to bio, right? Like Storm deals with bio very well when you can get it off properly. But the difficulty is that it's not an automatic, click on someone and you automatically get the Storm off. So it doesn't hard counter in that sense because your opponent still has plenty of moves he can make to deal with it. But so there's nothing inherently wrong with activated abilities. But when you have an activated ability that just shuts something down, like for example, let's say the old Seeker, or not the old Seeker. Let's see, what was
Void Rays, man.
Yeah, we can go with the Void Ray. We can go with the Void Ray. I think a Void Ray is a good example. The new Void Ray ability, I hate. Despise it. I actually don't like the Void Ray as a unit at all, because the old Void Ray ran counter to the notion of good unit design anyway, but I'll get into that. I can get into that another time. But the new ability, you had to charge it up so it was hard to use properly, because you had to charge it up ahead of time to make full use of it. And then get it to the fight within the time it was charged up without losing the charge. So that was difficult. But now it's just, you push a button and it gets a huge damage boost. Okay. Well, the cooldown isn't that long on that ability, so really, the activated ability's only function is, oh look, you're fighting units that are armored, push the button. You're not, don't push the button. Okay, the charge ran out, okay, retreat for a minute and come back. There's nothing to show off there. There's no decision making to make with the use of that ability. There's no positioning advantage to make use with that ability.
I mean, you don't even really have to make the decision not to push the button. You can just push the button all the time. You can be fighting Hydras. It does the same thing.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's just
Yeah, I think the thing is, when you have lots of active abilities, it's really hard to make them interesting. So you end up with just these active abilities that are straight up boring, and then they're just pointless. They might as well not be there if they're boring.
I mean, I love the Adept ability now that they added the ability to cancel it. I actually really didn't like it at all when it couldn't be canceled. But now that the ability to cancel it, it's a really good ability. The only way I would like it more is if they had the ability to toggle it to switch positions with the ghost, and then for the duration you could keep pushing the button every second or so to switch positions back and forth.
I think that would be
that's probably a little. It'd probably be a bit broken. I will admit it would be a bit broken, but so that ability is really cool, and that's an activated ability. That's very unique, and a very interesting ability, but you can't have too many of those, or every unit just gets boring and uninteresting. And then the only thing you're watching for when spectators are watching the game is the ability usage, and not the strategy.
Right.
People, you get less interested in the strategy when all you're looking for in skill is who used which abilities better.
Yeah. Like if you're playing Dota.
And Starcraft 2 is not a. Yeah.
In Starcraft 2, you have the carry that just right-clicks people. You always have the one guy who has a hero that right-clicks people, and that's it. In fights.
Well, it's the thing is this isn't a MOBA. This is a strategy game. So
of course.
the thing that should be interesting is the strategy and not the shiny lasers on the screen.
Right.
Yep.
At least to me. And if people really like the shiny lasers, I'm cool with that. But it shouldn't. But if you want people to play the game, and like if you want people to be interested in playing the game well at a high level, it can't just be a spectator sport. It has to be a fun game to play too.
Right.
So that is my opinion on that matter. You can't have too much. There's nothing wrong with activated abilities in small doses, but when you have too many of them, you stop paying attention to positioning in micro, and micro becomes entirely about using abilities and not in the rest of the control.
Yeah, I definitely agree.
Yep.
Any more questions? You get anything from the Twitter?
It doesn't look like we got anything just yet. I mean, WCS is going
Okay.
on right now, so.
Could answer
Okay.
Geico's question.
Yeah, we deliberately put this on the first day while WCS was on so that we'd have a lower audience, so that because this is our first one, in case we had problems or issues at all, we could deal with them very quickly.
And people wouldn't notice.
Yeah,
Everything is run mostly according to plan.
everything's gone very smoothly, better than I expected, but better be safe than sorry.
Right.
So that about brings us to the end. If there are no more questions, looks like we have one from
more.
Patty's.
Maybe that's just an opinion. Maybe just talk about Protoss and active abilities versus.
I don't really want to get into exclusive unit discussion right now because it was off topic. But if we could be here for another 3 hours doing that.
Fair enough.
Just in general, I think almost every race is getting to the point where they have too many activated abilities.
Maybe not Zerg, but just a move.
Yeah, and I mean it's okay for some units to be boring as long as. It's okay for some.
Such micro. Such unit control. Yep. Sorry, go on.
Yeah, so it's okay for some units to be boring, as long as it's in the context of a strategy that isn't boring. Okay, an individual tool of the tool set doesn't have to be very interesting, as long as everything else that's going on is interesting. Because you don't have to be. If everything is super exciting and you're trying to pay attention to everything, you're not going to be able to keep up with what's going on.
And it's not going to be interesting anyway, if that makes sense.
And it's gonna get boring very quickly.
Yeah.
It gets very tiring to watch. To try to pay attention to every little detail constantly. So I mean, I think it's completely okay that corruptors don't have any super special abilities as long as they do their job well.
Fair enough.
I just wish there was other things to make other than corruptors a lot of the time, and that making a corruptor was a decision that was made because it might be slightly better and not because it was the only decision to make. But
and also just
we went over this earlier.
Yeah.
Island maps. Not happening. Sorry, it's cool.
Do.
I don't know how to pronounce it.
Yeah.
I'm not even gonna try. So, is this it?
Yeah. Do you guys just want to wrap up? Joel, do you have anything else to say?
Yeah, I think we'll wrap up for now. And we'll have another episode in 2 weeks, and we can see what the topic is then.
All right, guys.
So I want to just ask anyone who has any comments on the show or additional questions to cover later. Feel free to post them on the thread on Team Liquid. If you want to post the thread link here in the stream chat or something or whatever.
Yeah, I can do that. And also
Here's
the
his low
Twitter
press.
account. Oh,
So very slow.
Oh, fuck you. Also, we have a Twitter account at TL Strategy Chat. So if you want to post suggestions or ideas for our next show, whatever you want, we can answer it there.
And next time we should have some more people on other than just the three of us. It's just the three of us today because most of Team Liquid Strategy is actually at the WCS event in person. And weren't able to join us right now. So you can expect to meet some more of the TML strategy team for next time.
And hopefully some more known people.
Right.
Yeah, and we will of course have some well-known guests from time to time and some pro players. So thanks for coming, everyone. Look forward to seeing you next time.
All right. See you guys later.
See ya.